Welcome back to Computers, Ethics, and Society. I'm Tom, and today we are starting our discussion of free speech on the internet. And we're kind of beginning with a primer on the First Amendment and the conception of free speech and some relevant features to how free speech kind of gets carried out on the internet. So the first thing to notice, of course, we're talking about the First Amendment, right? And so, the biggest thing about free speech is that that term free speech is a bit of a misnomer. It's somewhat misleading, right? For two reasons. One is that it does not mean that you can say whatever you want to say, right? Without consequences. It also does not really, it's not a debate about the ability to say anything, right? It's about certain forms of speech that we deem that should be protected. And the First Amendment in particular has to do with not having the government be able to censor protected speech, right? So the First Amendment reads that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or press. It also includes freedom of expression, right? Freedom of religion, the press, right to assemble, or petition the government, this kind of stuff. So, when it comes to free speech, when we're talking, the reason why we talk about protected speech is because, when it comes to things like mundane speech, right? So if I talk about what I had for breakfast or whether or not I tie my shoes right and then left or left and then right, that's not really an issue about the First Amendment, right? That's not really what we would consider protected speech. Why? Because it doesn't need protecting, right? But when we're talking about offensive or controversial speech, stuff in politics and, even things that are borderline threats and this kind of stuff, this is where, the First Amendment and the idea of protected speech really kind of comes into play. And as I mentioned, the other thing about the First Amendment and the idea of protected speech is that there are lots of forms of speech and lots of forms of censorship that are in play and are in play either in the private kind of sector in terms of like, at your job or something like this, there are things you can't say, but also, in the legal sector as well, right? We have clear categories for certain ways, certain things you can't say, right? Direct threats, you can't incite violence directly. You can't say false things that you know are false in order to smear another person. That's called defamation. You can't write things that you know are not true in order with the intention to harm someone, that's libel, right? These kinds of things. So there's lots of stuff lots of ways in which you're not supposed to express yourself, even from a legal standpoint, and that's perfectly consistent with First Amendment and even, I think, the ideology of free speech, right? So another distinction to make at the outset is there's a difference between a constitutional question, right? What does the First Amendment entitle you to do or say? And then the kind of second question of whether or not free speech is a moral value that we should have, right? Just because something's written in the Constitution doesn't make it an absolute truth, right? We can question those things. There are amendments that we think are not good. They've been changed, right? All these kinds of things, and we pass moral judgment on them. And so there's a question about, whether or not we endorse the First Amendment, do we endorse all of it? And also, like, how should it be implemented, right? So there's a lot of nuance here. And in this module, there's quite a bit. I give a number of videos and stuff like that to look at to kind of just give us a more context for the idea of free speech. right? So and when we talk about free expression, um, uh, there's lots that opens a lot of doors. I mentioned a couple questions in my notes. Is silence a kind of expression? Is that something that's protected by the First Amendment? Um, what about, some people talk about the right to be forgotten, right? Is that part of your expression to not want your name to come up on Google because of something that happened to you when you were 13 or something like this, right? Um, and these kinds of things. And you might also think search engines might filter or impede on our ability to get information or our ability to express ourselves. If you write something and Google decides to push it to the bottom of the search results, is that impeding on your First Amendment rights? These are questions, right, that kind of pull us into this um, arena of free speech on the internet. So, other thing to mention about the laws and the protection of speech is that you also can have an indirect law that basically de facto makes it so people are afraid to exercise their First Amendment rights, right? They call this a chilling effect, right? You can't have a law that maybe does not directly, prosecute people for saying some kind of like political speech, but it does kind of imply that anyone who says something similar or something like this would get prosecuted, or someone who I don't know, affiliates with a certain person in a certain way or something like this. That's another kind of component to the protection. So it's a little bit broader than just the government not having laws directly um, uh, um, forbidding certain kinds of speech, right? So this is like a general idea of First Amendment and this idea of free speech. But of course, the big debate for us moving forward will be talking about free speech when it comes to things like social media. Social media is an interesting category, right? So let's kind of spell this out a little bit. You have lots of different forms of media, right? You have print media, magazines, books, so on and so forth. You have broadcast TV and radio. And then you also have other ways in which you communicate with people, like the telephone or through letters and stuff like this. The first two, media, broadcast, TV, radio, whatnot, those are considered publishers. And what that means is that they are responsible for the content of the things that they publish, right? A television station or a radio station or a book publishing company is responsible for what they put out there. Contrast this with a phone company. They're not responsible in any way for what you say to your friend on the phone, right? They just provide the medium, right? And they're not involved in the content that goes on there. And that's considered just a common carrier, right? They just carry information. They're just a means of communication. Now, there is famous Section 203 of the Communications Decency Act, which basically says that any computer service should not be treated as a publisher, instead should be treated as a carrier, right? Which means that any computer service is not responsible for its content, right? And why is this significant? Well, a lot of different reasons why it is. One is that if you are regarded as a common carrier, right, and you run a social media site, right, Instagram, Facebook, whatever, that means that you are not on the hook for anything that anyone posts on there. On the one hand, you might think that's good, right? The people who are subscribers to those services are publishing of their own accord, and that should be their responsibility for what they post. On the other hand, it seems like someone like Facebook could allow all kinds of very bad activity to go on their platform and not be held responsible, right? The other component to this is that there is a battle between conflicting free speech rights, and one in which, you know, I think is often underappreciated, right? So if you post something on social media, um, and you say you're expressing, you're using your First Amendment right, but someone like, but the social media site decides they want to take it away, right? They can also say that they're expressing their First Amendment right, because it's their company, it's a private company, right? Private entities are not beholden to the First Amendment. So if you run a business and one of your employees is, mouthing off to a customer, you can fire that person. And if they say they're exercising their First Amendment right, you can say, no, you're not, right? Not in my business. I own it. And so it's my First Amendment freedom of expression to control and censor what people say when they're affiliated with that company, right? Now, what happens with this idea of this Section 203 of the Communications Decency Act is that many companies, social media companies, tend to want it both ways, right? On the one hand, I use Facebook as an example. On the one hand, whenever something bad happens on Facebook, Zuckerberg wants to say, oh, we're just a platform, we're not responsible for what people say. On the other hand, when they do decide that it behooves them to remove content, prioritize content, whatever, then they pull out the publisher card, right? And they say, this is our First Amendment right to, organize content in the way we want to, right? When it comes to advertisements and whatnot. And so, they really want it both ways. So far, really, when it comes to social media outfits have had it both ways. The restrictions that social media have made on posts and fact checking and all this stuff, that is a function of that entity as a private entity, that those are not lawfully enforced at all. It's an important point. Those are all internal policies, right? So, so becomes a big issue, especially when it comes to particular kinds of speech. I mean, we've seen quite a bit of this debate on social media, right? So another kind of aspect of the First Amendment and the idea of free speech is how to justify the idea of protecting free speech. Why should we do it? And, what's the ethical basis for doing this? Some arguments for the First Amendment have to do with, well, the reason why we protect free speech is because it facilitates democracy in a certain way, facilitates discussion, opposing points of view, this kind of stuff, which is okay. I mean, it's a good intuitive way to justify it, but it seems to leave out all kinds of other protected speech that we want to say should be protected. So, for example, art, right? Art is not really about facilitating democracy, at least straightforwardly. And so it seems like if your reason for having protected speech is political, then it seems like non-political speech would not fall in the protected category, right? Another way to think about free speech is that the reason why we need to promote it is because having different sides of an argument facilitates knowing what is true, right? Getting at the truth. If that is your view, your kind of anchor there, for deciding what kind of speech is protected, well, then it seems like things that are obviously not true would not be protected, right? So I give an example of maybe like creationists or flat earthers, or, what if I say, 2 + 2 = 6? Does that mean that I could be prosecuted for something like that? Like it just, it's not comprehensive enough of a um, justification for the way in which we protect speech. So it becomes very difficult to find out what is the value behind protecting speech, right? Um, Now, one last thing I like to mention here, which is important, especially moving forward, because we'll spend a little bit of time on this idea of protected speech on the internet, is Mill's view on this. We know Mill as consequentialist, right? He also had lots of interesting social and political ideas. And one that I think did come up when we were doing the unit on Mill is the idea of his harm principle. Now, his harm principle is basically that the only restriction on one's freedom of expression, right? And this time we're talking about freedom of expression, could be talking about rights in general, should be when it prevents harm to others, right? So the only reason why there should be a law against me saying whatever I want to is if that expression will directly harm someone else, right? So this is the idea behind something like defamation, right? I can't just say anything I want to, because what if what I'm saying harms another person's livelihood in some way? Now, of course, the idea of harm here has to be specified a little bit, because a lot of times when you say the truth and someone doesn't want to hear that truth, they could claim that you harmed them. So Mill makes a distinction between legitimate and illegitimate harms, right? So, an illegitimate harm is kind of, you know, when you are kind of doing like a genuine harm, when you're really being kind of, he says, a positive instigation of a mischievous act. It's when you're kind of hurting someone, but there's no kind of real end game in there, right? You're just kind of doing it to hurt someone else, like in the case of defamation. Whereas if you tell someone like something like a hard truth, then there is kind of a reason for doing that, and that would be considered more like a legitimate harm, right? Tell someone something they don't want to hear, but is the truth, right? Um, Now, so this is a principle that helps us kind of sort out between, I think, cases in which you're expressing yourself freely and that other people maybe don't agree or don't like it, versus when you're expressing yourself in a way that genuinely is causing harm to others. And that's a fine line that we want to walk. And we'll look at some different tools about how to walk that line, some different takes on different kinds of speech, and where they fall on that line. Right. So anyways, that's it for today. We will be talking again soon.